The Cloudcast is sponsored by Intel Cloud for All, driving the creation of tens of thousands of clouds.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another episode of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's been a while because we had some technical difficulties. Then we got through the technical difficulties. Then I actually missed one, and you picked up Amy Lewis, and I feared for my job. I thought, hopefully I was going to be able to keep going with the Cloudcast. So thanks for having me back, Brian.
Yeah, good to have you back. I know if it had gone two, we might have had to get rid of you. So hey, you're gonna be proud of me. I watched the preview for the next Star Wars movie. Is that what's it called? Rebel One, or but this one is like before the Rogue Star Wars movies, right?
Yes, okay. Exactly. It's the time in between, if you will. It's okay, so way back when of how did they get the Death Star plans, right?
Yeah. So here's my thing, right? So Star Wars is apparently set in the future, right? Like way in the future.
Yep.
Okay. So here's my question, because we may have to shut the podcast down because of this. So if I picked it up right, you basically have this person who's going to steal the plans for the Death Star, and somehow, and then the next movie doesn't take place for like another 20 years or something, right? Or 10 years or 5 years or something.
Right.
Sort of. Okay.
Yep.
So explain this to me. Number one, how did the plans not leak out into the internet? Number two, how was there not an open source Death Star then built from those plans?
True.
Because if those things aren't going to happen, all this stuff that we're doing right now is completely useless, because we're of course sort of convinced that's the way things get built these days. And if that's not going to happen in the future, we might have to shut down the podcast.
Fair enough. Well, let's ask our guests. So our guest this evening, we have Mitchell Hashimoto from Hashicorp, founder of Hashicorp. Hello. And it's been a little while, Mitchell. It's been at least a year since you've been on the podcast. So welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Yes,
I think it's been about a year and a half.
It's been way too long. And so what's your thoughts, man? Open source
on the Death Star?
Yeah.
It sounds mostly like a funding issue more than anything else. I think there's plenty of motivated engineers to build something the caliber of a Death Star out there.
So now people just have to figure out when the downturn is for the next funding round for the Death Star. You got to get it before that happens. So.
Yeah,
Aaron, I thought you'd be proud of me though. I got a little bit of science fiction in my life.
Yes, I know. I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed. All right, so Mitchell, let's just jump right into it.
Sure.
I mean, it's like you were saying, it's been probably a year and a half since you've been on the show, and things are changing so fast, both with Hashicorp as well as just the market in general. So what are you seeing? What's going on? What's interesting to you these days?
Oh man, yeah, a lot's been happening. I think that I think we continue now. I say we in a very general sense here, like as an industry, just continue to push the boundaries of automation and ease of application deployments and infrastructure management. And I think since we talked, I think the major things probably been happening has been at the fringe edges, like things like. Fringe edges, things like Lambda, coming out is kind of interesting, and even the rise of things like Kubernetes sort of overtaking in some ways the container world hype machine, and I mean everything else has been chugging along too. So it's just been more and more new fancy things, and from our perspective, from like a customer perspective, I mean, we work with enterprises, and it's been more and more just cloud adoption more than anything, and that's been really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, you guys, one of the things that we always like about having you on the show is, you guys have always been super pragmatic, right? You started as people who were building, and you were running things. You built tools that you needed for yourselves. You turned it into Hashicorp, Vagrant, and everything else. And so we always like to get the perspective on that. You guys recently made all of your tools compatible with Azure. which is, everything for a long time was AWS. And what's the, obviously the Microsoft team has been doing a lot of really cool things. What are you hearing from your customers in terms of the services from Azure they like, or just Azure in general? What's driving them to push you guys to be more, Azure friendly and capable and everything?
Yeah, and I do want to just mention that we did a big Google push too, so not to leave them out. But
okay.
But Azure is really interesting because I think that overall we're seeing a lot of interest in non-Amazon clouds infrastructures right now, and I have various opinions on that. But from an Azure perspective, I think they're doing a really fantastic job. Microsoft in general of kind of catering to their current and sort of not lost customers, probably, since everyone used to run Windows, but people that are already Windows shops are very comfortable with sort of where Azure is going, and we're seeing a lot of requests to use Azure. And to be fair, I mean, the companies that are requesting us to use Azure are not the hot Silicon Valley startups. They're usually more boring, older, successful companies. But I think that's a really good sign for cloud in general, that the boring companies are adopting cloud, and whether that's Azure or Amazon or whatever, it's a good sign for everyone. And it motivated us to support Azure because, like you said, we try to be the pragmatic vendor, so to speak. So a lot of these old successful companies happened to come to us just because our tools work with a lot of things, and Azure popped up, and we did a big unified push across all our open source projects to support Azure. And it was difficult. It wasn't easy, but Microsoft, we worked with them, and they were a big help in getting things going. I think that they weren't used to the level of automation and API usage that our tools push. They're more used to this slower UI based stuff. So we found some issues, they fixed them. We gave some feedback on the API, and I think that things are looking pretty good now.
Yeah. So you bring up multiple kind of interesting points there, and I kind of will run through them here. So first of all, I've heard from multiple folks now that the Azure stuff from an API standpoint was a little behind, but they also seem to be really willing to work with folks to address some of those gaps over time. So that's interesting. But I also am wondering too, when you're saying like, okay, you've got things working with Azure, you've got things working with Google Cloud, and I don't know that we've ever talked about it on the show per se, but Brian, you were out at the Google Compute conference.
Yep.
And it almost seems like, if I'm going to really over stereotype for a second, it almost seems like Google Compute has in some ways almost taken that startup market that Amazon is now pushing towards the enterprise, and then Azure is super enterprise. So it's almost like three flavors of cloud depending on your market. And I don't know if that's necessarily what you saw, Brian, but I was kind of watching the keynotes remotely. But Mitchell, does that sound like a fair assessment of the state of the big three public clouds these days?
It sounds pretty. I mean, it's very insightful. I think that I'm not sure if the market segments that cleanly, but Google's pushing really hard in terms of credits and features. I mean, they're shipping Container Engine and the Kubernetes stuff and things like that. That caters very much to the greenfield startup crowd. And Azure doesn't really ever get pitched as with the sexy features or anything like that, but I've been hearing some good things. And one of the major things that Azure does that no other public cloud provider, none of the big three public cloud providers have currently, is they have Azure Stack, which is the on-premise solution that gives you Azure equivalent APIs just on your own premises. So I think that's very, very attractive to the old enterprise, big enterprise. And so I think it's really interesting to see all their different strategies go. And it's too early to tell what's going to happen, but I'm sure in another couple of years we'll know a lot more. But from a Hashicorp perspective, we work with all of them. They all work, and I like all of them for different reasons, and so you can't really go wrong today with infrastructure providers.
Yeah. No, that's. Let me ask this: because you guys see kind of this really broad spectrum. Are you seeing anything in terms of trends for especially in the enterprise, because again, you guys, like you've always said, you're sort of targeting the enterprise. Any trends sort of popping up that are sort of that second wave? What's getting them started into wanting to use the cloud and automation more, or just a second wave of like the types of projects that you're seeing? Not the really early adopters, the skunkworks projects, but the more mainstream types of things. Any trends you're seeing there, or patterns that are starting to emerge?
Yeah, and to be completely clear for any like listeners too, like the customers we see, I mean, the paying customers we see are at big enterprises, and the adoption we see is from like the millions in the community and startups and stuff. So we see both, which is kind of interesting. We're a lot more close to the enterprises just because we work with them and have sales deals with them and things like that. But I think the mainstream trend that's kind of interesting with these enterprises is broad adoption of the cloud across industries I wouldn't expect to be using the cloud so early, but also the companies that were a little bit more forward thinking and are starting to complete or be very confident in their cloud transitions. If they're we sort of see that the cloud transition from full physical to full cloud takes a number of years, and for the companies that are sort of nearing the end, if they're a year away and they're confident that the path is clear how they get there, what they're starting to do now, which is really, really interesting, is they're starting to plan a secondary cloud, and so a secondary provider. So everyone, I think the elephant in the room is mostly everyone's moving to AWS, and they're the big one. But we're seeing a lot of these companies say, okay, we're 90% on AWS. We'll be 98% on AWS in 12 months. The team that kickstarted the AWS transition is going to break off, and now we're going to figure out our Azure plan. And what's interesting is they seem to not be doing it they don't actually plan on moving to like this secondary cloud platform, whatever they choose. They're using it as a leverage sort of mechanism, which is like if we could work with tools like Hashicorp and be cloud agnostic in a way, and we have a tested plan, and a rehearsed plan for transitioning all of our services to another cloud platform in say like 6 to 8 weeks, then we have a lot of leverage in terms of price negotiations and things like that. Because if someone is willing to give us a really good deal for like a 3-year reserved price, then we could be there and we got locked in, and that's great. But when that negotiation sort of comes up for pricing, then we have a lot of leverage in terms of like, well, if this doesn't work out in 2 months, we could be on a totally different cloud platform. And I think that's kind of interesting. I'm seeing it pop up here and there, and I'm kind of curious if that's going to be a thing over the next few years. So, yeah.
Well, and it almost suddenly becomes a combination of, the utility pay-as-you-go model, but locking in discounts longer term to almost where like, in the infrastructure world, you bought servers every 3 years, and you bought, storage every 5 to 7 years. And you always at the end of those contracts renegotiated and there's pairing everyone against each other and, having everyone fight it out of who gets your business for the next couple of years. Well, guess what? It came to the utility model as well.
Yeah. And I think that's going to push the sort of where the money is in that industry. It's going to push it to higher level things. So that's where things like what we're doing, things like security, but what other people are doing like Kubernetes become very interesting, because that's not at the utility. It's not utility scale for probably a number of years.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean it makes total sense. It's the classic enterprise, second vendor, leverage, third vendor sort of leverage type of thing. The other thing I saw that was sort of interesting when I was at the Google event, and I won't disclose the customer just because I can't remember if I was supposed to be under NDA or not. But one of the things they brought up was while they look at, say, the Google Cloud as, one entity, they sort of look at the regions of how they deploy or where they deploy as sort of, their own thing. So they're watching like, how quickly services get into Southeast Asia or Brazil or something like that. What's close to Russia. They're watching kind of those competitive things within the cloud just as closely as they're watching like the pricing, so they're, and this was an international company and operate all over the place, but literally like they were sort of saying, well, deploying into certain regions of the world have different pain points. And if such and such a provider, whether it's Google or AWS or Azure or whoever, can help me faster in that one or make it much less painless. Because it might be, government issues, it could be tariff issues, it could be all sorts of things. They're starting to get to that level of intelligence in terms of, how they're looking at the different clouds, which I thought was, pretty sophisticated way of, sort of next step forward.
Yeah, interesting.
So let's talk Nomad for a second, because we did kind of want to, as another topic, you mentioned Kubernetes, and it seems like, if we were talking way back when, it was everyone had their own OpenStack flavor. Now it seems like everyone has their own Kubernetes flavor. And like what I really wanted to talk about, and to kind of kick it off is we a while ago we saw Docker, and Swarm going, up to like 30,000, 50,000 containers, something like that. Cloud Foundry is doing like 25,000. And then Nomad comes out with 1 million containers.
Yeah.
And, which is an incredible number, but at the same time, it makes me go, well, who needs or does that, and how in the world would you manage 1 million containers, right? So what are your thoughts around all of that in general right now and the kind of the state of the market?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, we've been working on so we came out with Nomad at our conference last year in I think it was September, Nomad 0.1, and before it was ever released, I gave sort of we're a small company, the Nomad team was a small team at the time, and it was just a couple people, and I was talking to them in person. We were all in town for the conferences before we ever announced Nomad, and we're we're all in the same hotel, and we're hanging out in one of the rooms, and I was like, well, my goal is really we need Nomad to schedule 1 million containers, and there was some people that were just super excited just because big numbers are exciting. And of course, there was immediate internal feedback of like, well, why? I mean, no one has 1 million containers. Like, no one needs 1 million containers. Why would we do that? And then when we announced it, there was that was our biggest sort of, not negative, but criticism in a way, was why does that matter? And sort of my answer to that I gave on Hacker News actually in a comment is sort of like, I fly a lot. I consider sort of like flying my hobby in a way, even though I mostly just do it for work. I like to understand airlines. I like to understand airplanes. And if you look at planes like Boeings or Airbuses, they're so over-engineered. And the reason that they're over-engineered is because that even in really stressful scenarios, they're so under their limit that you're going to be fine. So the example I use is the wings. Like wings on the latest 787 are designed so that they could bend upwards a significant number of degrees. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but let's just go with 45. It might actually be more than that, but they could bend maybe 45 degrees upwards and downwards. And in practice, there's been no sort of event in recorded history where wings have ever bent that far. But despite that, they can before they break. And it's not because they're actually going to ever reach that point. It's because that as a user of the plane, whether you're buying the airplane and going to fly people or you are the person on the airplane, that's not going to be the failure case. So with Nomad, we really wanted to show that, if you needed to schedule a lot of things really quickly, then that's never going to be the problem with Nomad. And then the next question is, why would I ever want to schedule things really quickly? And schedulers in general could be used as a replacement for a lot of queuing tasks. So we've started to use Nomad to replace our queues for things like user activation emails or billing runs per user. Instead of scheduling the billing job that could overall fail, we just actually schedule a billing job for every user. So we suddenly inject thousands of billing jobs into the Nomad queue. And the reason is because if one user's billing job fails, Nomad will reschedule it. And that way we make things faster overall. We don't have to deal with failure so much in the job itself. And we know that, yes, on a day-to-day basis, Nomad doesn't get any influx of jobs. It's very, very stable. It's just sitting there. But once a month, suddenly out of nowhere, it gets thousands in the matter of seconds. But now we know that that's never really going to fail. And so that's what we're trying to show with the Million Container Challenge.
Interesting. There's a couple things that popped up when you were talking about that. One of them was, you're talking about it sort of replacing a queuing system, which, makes me think of things like NATs and other, big queuing systems. But it also got me thinking about, we've been doing a bunch of shows about serverless stuff, and you start going, oh, okay. If I'm doing events, if I'm doing lots and lots of events, you could definitely see, as people start to get into stuff like IoT or any sort of, you could be talking about building a service that's looking at, tweets during like the election or something like that, where you literally have, thousands, tens of thousands of things going on. And so, yeah, it sounds like a crazy number to begin with, but you start thinking about some of the things we live in the world today, and it's like, yeah, we could very well come into play. The other thing that sort of jumped to my mind was, if you guys are doing 1 million, and some of the other folks in the market are doing, an order of magnitude less than that, give or take. Do you have customers yet that are sophisticated enough to start to understand the differences in some of these scheduling things? I mean, I know in previous worlds when we were talking about, network routing protocols, or all, you eventually got people who were really sophisticated and understand why one scales better than the other. Do you see that yet in the marketplace, or do they just go, cool, it does 1 million, I'm not there yet, I'm going to trust you guys, like, it's good?
No, the understanding is strong, and I think the reason the understanding is strong is because if you even know what a scheduler is today, you're sort of a step ahead, sort of on the understanding train. And so the understanding is really good. I think that schedulers are still at a very, very early, not mainstream, not being even deployed into production phase. But it's also something that is incredibly complicated, and I think is the sort of paradigm of the future. So it's a place we wanted to be, and every sort of major company is doing POCs and office of the CTO type stuff, experimenting with schedulers and trying to figure them out. And we wanted to make sure that we were in there too. So that's sort of what we're doing. But I think we're still a 1 or 2 or 3 years off from starting to see real production deployments at a very large scale with these things.
Yeah, it's interesting because we almost have this cycle that seems to be going over and over in the industry, no matter which shiny object of technology is kind of the latest one. Of it always starts with a whole bunch of folks kind of getting into that area, and then a bunch of confusion, and then eventually some kind of market shakeout and long-term consolidation down to just a couple players. But I mean, these cycles take 3 to 5 to 7 years to shake out. And so I agree. It very much seems like we're in very, very early days with something like that, without a doubt.
Yeah, and I think especially with schedulers, I think that it's a very hard thing to enter in general. But I think that to make one a naive one is fairly simple, and to make one that'll work in the necessary number of cases for a real production workload is very, very difficult. And so I think I don't think we'll see too many, and I think that, like you said, sort of over the 3 to 5 year period, it'll sort of one will emerge or two will emerge as sort of the ones that work.
Yeah. Hey, let me ask you, you always come on and give us, sometimes we talk about products, sometimes we'll talk about a product update. But we always sort of venture into this realm where you kind of go, we have a bigger vision of how we want to do stuff. And I talked to you about Vagrant, and you said there's a lot more to come. And then, eventually it turned into Atlas. And so fill us in a little bit. Like, we don't deal with a whole lot of security. I know security is kind of a passion for you, in this space. Like, talk to us a little bit about kind of where you see, not just scheduling and automation, but kind of where security fits into that, and what you hear from the market, and kind of your view on security in the data center and the cloud.
Yeah, so we, to put some color on this, we came out with Vault last May, so it's still not even a year old. We're about to be a year old on Vault, and despite not being a year old, it is our fastest adopted project in production of all time. It has become the revenue leader for Hashicorp in less than a year, despite being so young, and it's been really interesting to see sort of how important security has been, and to us, it's also sort of a surprise at how quickly it's been adopted. And so our view on security is really that security doesn't really fit in a model, in a diagram of where things get laid in a data center, because security is just everywhere. Like, it would just be a layer on top of everything. Every single thing has to have some understanding of security and concepts like secret storage or identity or authorization. Everything sort of has to have that sort of base level concept. So we built Vault, and our view in security is, so we call that model the Zero-Trust Datacenter, and that sort of concept is we're going from where we had a physical premise where you could actually see the entry points and exit points of your data center, both the network and just physical entrances, and moving towards the cloud where everything is basically always connected, or it's unclear what isn't and isn't connected. You can make more advanced networks, but it's all software. So it's not a real physical barrier. And in both that switch and as well as just trends of, in the United States, we've seen a lot of breaches in the past few years. We've seen the whole government and Snowden type things come out in the past few years. And I think overall the mood has shifted to where as people are transitioning to the cloud, they're also taking it as an opportunity to rethink security. And our model is zero trust, and that is basically that you start from a position of not trusting anyone and not being able to do anything, and then that thing is given privilege in various ways. So as part of that model, we sort of built Vault, and sort of the other phrase or something you hear in the security world from some people is with security, what you want to do is put all your eggs in one basket and then put that basket in Fort Knox. And we're trying to make Vault Fort Knox. Is basically you really want to do security exceptionally well in one location. Strive for perfection in one place rather than splitting your efforts across a number of different locations. So Vault is trying to sort of own secret management, identity, certificates, all that sort of stuff. So we've been doing Vault, and I think that's just the major trend of that sort of thing. You don't really have physical hardware security devices anymore. So HSMs, I think, are going to struggle if they're not already, sort of in the cloud world. And overall, it's going to be very, very different. And I think it's just the beginning. We're not seeing the full integration of security with everything yet.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense, and I think it's interesting as we talk to a bunch of different companies, cloud companies, and people in this space and so forth. Security seems to be one of those things that you can sort of definitively go, yes, I know I need that, and there's people who pay for it, and there's groups that sort of understand it, whether it's for new technology or old technology. So sort of security follows general practices, whether it's the latest buzz or sort of old stuff. So it's and it doesn't. I like the approach you guys have. It should be everywhere. It's not sort of a layer in a stack. It's not something you bolt on. It has to be there and be really good at least a couple of things. So very cool. What's coming up next for Hashicorp? You always have HashiConf is a new thing. It did really well last year. What's going on with the company, and where can people find you guys out and about?
So we have two conferences this year, one in Europe and one in the US. And our focus, for the past couple of years, we've been releasing a lot of tools and coming out with a lot of things, and we definitely have no shortage of ideas. But our focus this year, as you'll see with the announcements we'll make at our two conferences, are really all about the themes of sort of simplicity and stability. So while we've done a big expansion over the past couple of years, we're really focusing on making everything that we have work exceptionally well. So you'll see all our efforts. They're continuous, but you'll see highlights of them at our conferences, as well as some secret stuff we've been working on, but sort of all part of that theme. And as a business, we've been focusing super hard on our enterprise products. So we've sort of not publicly announced, but it's not a secret. We just sort of rolled out enterprise versions of Console, Terraform, and Vault. And they've been sort of for sale behind the scenes for a number of quarters prior to our public announcement. We just from people emailing us, and now we're starting to talk about them publicly, and we'll do more announcements and stuff later as we have more to show people, and that's sort of been the big push. So sort of turning Hashicorp into a more revenue generating business rather than purely just a funded startup, making that transition happen right now, and that's been going well. So that's been sort of the big both business and engineering side of things. We continue to see we're really happy with all the adoption. Like I said, with Vault, we're just really surprised how much it is. But in the past, since we last talked, the other one that's really taken off is Terraform. So Terraform has really hit an inflection point in terms of its growth, and it's actually really hard to control because we recently surpassed, and I'm not proud of this, 1,000 issues on Terraform, and most of them are feature requests, but still, that's by almost 5 times our largest project by issue count, and so we're trying to get a hold of that and figure it out. But it's all good problems.
He's running into the teenage years, Aaron. Every day's a new adventure. Well, that's cool. It's been. I know. We Aaron and I always talk about this. Like it's always cool to see the companies that we got to know when they were really. I think when we first met you and first started talking to you, it was you and maybe it's you, your one partner, and somebody else, and now you guys are growing like crazy. So it's cool to follow how much it's growing up. So appreciate you always coming back and talking to us. It's fun. It's fun to talk about change at a multi-year scale. It's always interesting.
Nice. Very cool. Awesome. Well, I think we are out of time for this week. Mitchell, thank you very much for being a guest once again, and a multi-year Cloudcast alum at this point. So certainly looking forward to having you back on again in the future. But on behalf of Mitchell and Brian, thank you everyone for listening this week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.